Welcome. Um, it is great to see all of you here today, and forgive my glasses because I've reached that age when I can't see down, but then I can't see up. It's that thing. But in any case, my name is Holly Rivers, and I am the Associate Director at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. And we want to welcome you here today, along with our co-presenter, the Department of Anthropology, and our co-sponsors, the Institute for the Scholarship and the Liberal Arts and the Center for Educational Research and Action. We're here today to launch Susan Blum's book, Schoolishness, Alienated Education, and the Quest for Authentic, Joyful Learning. That book was recently published by Cornell University Press, and we are very excited to hear the conversation today. Susan is a professor of anthropology here at the University of Notre Dame, and she's been a faculty fellow of the Kellogg Institute since 2004. She's written about both China and education over her long career. And as you probably have seen, she has focused in recent decades on higher education with a trilogy of books she has published, including the one today, and other books, one called My Word, Plagiarism and College Culture, and one, I Love Learning, I Hate School, an Anthropology of College. She's also published an edited collection, Upgrading Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead. Having been here at the Institute for the past few decades as well, I can tell you she's been an incredibly good citizen of the Institute. She writes about higher education and the experience in the classroom, but she also practices it. As someone who cares very deeply about undergraduate education, I am often inspired by her work with students. And she has worked with many students in our Kellogg International Scholars Program. And I believe some of them may have also contributed to the research that's led to this book. Kellogg has also supported her in her research over the past few years, so we're quite interested to hear about her work today. Accompanying her this afternoon is Jean Lave, Professor Emerita at the University of California, Berkeley, whom I just learned is fine with being here because she's actually living in Indiana, so she's okay. She is a social anthropologist who theorizes learning as changing participation in ongoing changing practice. Her life work challenges conventional theories of learning and education. She earned a doctorate in social anthropology from Harvard University and is the author of many books. And she pioneered the theories of situated learning and communities of practice with her publication of her seminal text, Situated Learning, Legitimate Peripheral Participation, in collaboration with her student Etienne Wenger, who I'm sure I pronounced incorrectly, and she published by Cambridge University Press in 1991. Also joining her is Reverend Hugh Page. If you have been around this university for very long, you know he's held several very significant positions. And currently, he's the Vice President for Institutional Transformation and advisor to the President. He's also a professor of Theology and Africana Studies. He has been a faculty at Notre Dame since 1992 and is the author or editor of many books, including Exploring New Paradigms in Biblical and Cognate Studies and The Myth of Cosmic Rebellion, a study of its reflexes in Ugaritic and biblical literature. An Episcopal priest, he holds a doctorate in ministry from the Graduate Theological Foundation and a doctorate in Near Eastern language and civilizations from Harvard University. He's also a rather amazing musician, which I'll just put on the side. In any case, we are here to discuss Susan's new book, Schoolishness, Alienated Education, and the Quest for Authentic, Joyful Learning. The book presents a theory-based phenomenology of institutional education. She defines schoolishness, and I look at this closely because I used to be a high school English teacher, as educational practices that emphasize package learning, unimaginative teaching, uniformity, constant evaluation by others, arbitrary forms, predetermined time, and artificial boundaries resulting in personal and educational alienation, dependence, and dread. Drawing on critical, progressive, and feminist pedagogy in conversation with the anthropology of learning, and building on the insight of her two previous books, she proposes less schoolish ways of learning in 10 dimensions to lessen the mismatch between learning in school and learning in the wild. So I've heard her speak a bit about this research at a conference that she did for advisors on campus several months ago. And so I'm very interested in what she will say today. And that is enough from me, so I will turn it over to Susan to share about her book.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Holly, for that. I'm going to keep my thanks brief, I hope. So I wanted to thank the Kellogg Institute for hosting this. The Kellogg Institute, as Holly said, hosted a conference in 2012 called Learning in and Out of School, Education Across the Globe. So I've been trying to figure out for a really long time, what is learning in school? What is learning out of school? What is the relationship between them? What do we learn from across the globe, across grade levels, across different kinds of learning? I'm so excited to be here again, showing you sort of what I've learned since then. The tagline for that conference was a quote from Aristotle called, "All humans by nature desire to know." So that's not usually what you hear in school, and that contradiction has really puzzled me for a long time. And maybe I'm a slow learner, but it's taken me decades to really figure this out. I wanted, before I go on, to thank the Department of Anthropology for hosting this, Lee Gettler, who's chair, Eileen Bahraini, Michelle Thornton, and everybody else, all my colleagues who have come, the graduate students. Want to thank Isla, who has been so generous to me over the years. They have paid for editing, they have paid for indexing for all of my books, which is a great relief. And they also funded the images in this new book and several other things. I want to thank the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study of Blessed Memory. I had a one-semester fellowship there, which was really helpful. I want to thank Nicole McNeil for the Center for Educational Research and Action. So research, action, that's kind of the mandate, right? I want to thank the Office of Research, which funded many things, the Bowman Creek Project, which is now called the Center for Civil Engagement, which was also funded by NSF. I want to thank Jean Lave for coming, Hugh Page for being here. My parents, who, if the tech worked for them, are watching. Well, it's working on this end. I hope it's working on their end, but I often help troubleshoot the tech, but I'm busy now. I want to I want to thank Cornell University Press, Fran Benson, Jim Lance, who have seen 3 books through this process, West Virginia University Press, and mostly my students. I have had students, I've been teaching for more than 30 years, not all here. I've taught at a range of institutions. My students in my classes, on my research projects, have been my interlocutors in the field. And as my attention has turned to education, I interact every day with the people we used to call, what did we call them? We call them interlocutors now. We call informants. We used to call them informants, which seems old. But my students over the years, they have been allies, but sometimes they've pushed me. Sometimes they have challenged me. Sometimes things haven't gone well. And that kind of tension and conflict can also be very generative. So I could spend an hour talking about gratitude. I have a chapter in the book called Allies and Acknowledgements, Having Company. And I've tried on there to remember everybody. So I have not done that now. I probably should acknowledge my spouse, Lionel Jensen, who is here, who is always behind everything. So I would like us to take a minute, and if you are willing and able, please stand up, approach someone you don't know, and tell them something you learned today, or just teach them something that you already know. So we'll take a minute. Oh, not good. All right. What did you learn today? I have learned that there are a lot of people who work hard to make events happen. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for this exercise.
Excuse me, it's time to return to the events, please.
All right. So thank you for this. What we just did was a less schoolish version of gathering, right? What we did was we took away some of the authority of the teacher or the speaker, and we made it more horizontal. We made it so that you were talking to each other, learning from and teaching each other. And there was physical movement. So there were a lot of things that happened in that minute. You wanted to keep going, and that's a beautiful thing. So those are ways that I haven't actually ever done that before, but those are ways that one might challenge schoolishness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I want to talk a little bit about my genealogy and this book. As Holly said, I have been working on this and thinking about it for a really long time. And part of it came from my own love of school as a child, as a student, as a graduate student, and as a teacher. But sometimes things didn't work well. Sometimes students didn't thrive. Sometimes they didn't like what was happening. And the kind of typical faculty grumbling was to blame the students. And I did that too. I thought, well, if they don't love school, the problem must be them. But as an anthropologist, I began to ask questions. So in anthropology, it meant about half of the people in this room are anthropologists, so yay. But we have a phrase that we repeat over and over. It is that anthropology makes the strange familiar and the familiar strange. If I went down a Reddit rabbit hole trying to trace that phrase, which it turns out is not only from Melford Spiro, but he got it also from Eliot and, let's see, Wordsworth and Novalis and Coleridge and Eliot and Percy Shelley and Nietzsche and William James and Victor Shklovsky and Brecht. So many, many people have been playing with this idea of the familiar and the strange and making something strange. So the first half of my career, I studied China, and China became, instead of being strange to me, it became familiar. China became a place that I came to know well. It came to be part of my life. But then, like so many anthropologists, I turned my gaze to my own society and my own situation. And then things that had been completely familiar, completely ordinary and unquestioned became strange. Why do we have timed tests? What is the benefit of speed? Why, if people are such great learners outside school, does school make learning so hard? Why, if in all societies, people are assumed to be successful at learning so they can become members of their society, why is failure always seen as a kind of threat? If children are really curious all the time when they begin school, why does that curiosity wane over the time they're in school? And there were so many questions. So I began to study it using ethnographic techniques, having students interview other undergraduate students. I began to look at plagiarism as this phenomenon that in part reflected ideas of ownership and authorship and originality, which is connected to my training in linguistic anthropology, but it also has to do with what people see as the value of school. Why are they in school? And this then led me to really question, why are people here? Are they here for the degree? If they're here for the degree, then any path to the degree seems appropriate, and cutting corners seems completely efficient. It seems practical to do things however quickly you can do it. This is kind of relevant again with the panics about AI and what is happening when students are turning in work that they have not thought about or done. But if the goal is to get the credits, the grade, the credential, then turning something in, whatever it is, seems effective. But if the goal is learning, if the goal is thriving, if the goal is changing as a person, then you can't do it quite the same way. So I began to study education more and more and more. And one of the things that's strange is that school has not existed very long. It's hard for us when school seems dominant over in the childhood of everybody we know to realize that there have been schools. Like since there was writing, there were schools. So scribes went to school. They hated it too. They really did. They had to be beaten to stay in their school. They rebelled against their masters, but it was only a very small percentage of the population that went to school. It's really only in the last 100, maybe 150 years in the US and some other places, but it's really only since the end of World War II that every child in the world is expected to go to a lot of school. And if you look at the charts of how much schooling people have, everywhere in the world, it has increased and increased and increased. And if you look, this is where the Kellogg goals and themes is relevant. If you look at the goals of, let's say, human development, the goal is for people to have more school. The goal is for everybody to graduate from middle school and then high school. So more and more and more school. People have called this the education gospel, the idea that more school is good, and the more school, the more people have, the better society will be. But is school good? Is it good for the learners? Is it doing what we think it should be doing? So then I began to look at the structures of school, because we know that some people thrive. Some people are really good at school, and I bet most of the people in this room are good at school. But I bet some of the people in this room had uneven experiences with school. Maybe you got in trouble. Maybe you didn't want to go. Maybe your homework was boring. The statistics about boredom in school are extraordinary. In high school, most students are bored almost every day. That's an indictment. If we're making people go to school all day, all their waking hours, most of their waking hours, and they're bored and alienated, that surely isn't what we want. So I began to use anthropological and critical questions to try to figure out what are these structures. And I came up with 10 dimensions of schoolishness that I think helped me think, having to do with certain kinds of time, certain kinds of space. This is a schoolish space, but we made it a little less schoolish when I had you stand up. And so this space presupposes a sage on the stage. There's a literal stage. I don't know if I'm a sage, But there is this model, and the idea is that the students are receiving whatever the teacher is giving them. There, Paulo Freire talked about these empty vessels that are being poured into, and yet we know that people are really curious. They love learning things outside school. So what are these structures, and how does that get in the way of what we all probably want, which is the well-being, thriving, learning, meaningfulness, and if possible, joy of our learners? So this term schoolishness, I'm not committed to the term. It's been helpful for me to think with. I first saw it in an article that was written in 2015 that is no longer available on the web by Brian Stobnick, called "Let's Bury the 5-Paragraph Essay, Long Live Authentic Writing." Since I published the book, I found it occurred in a 2011 article by Anne Elrod Whitney. Peter Gray, the psychologist, has also used the term schoolishness. Akilah Richards, who works in unschooling for families, has also used the term schoolishness. There's an article from 1890 called "The Kindergarten." They're claiming that kindergartens are too schoolish. But since then, I've looked it up. I didn't actually do this. For some reason, it didn't occur to me. But in the Oxford English Dictionary, the first use in English that they have of this term is from 1549. So knowing how English works, how words combine, schoolish is something that people understand. So for me, I think it was helpful to think with. But I want to quote a Warring States Chinese philosopher named Zhuangzi, writer, maybe mythical, I don't know. I wrote my master's thesis on Zhuangzi, and so the term schoolishness is not something I will fight for. And here's what Zhuangzi says: "The fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've forgotten the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. Where can I find a man who has forgotten words so I can talk with him?" So Zhuangzi is reminding us that these labels for things are useful until they're not. So I have organized the book around concepts for me of alienation and authenticity, which many of you political theorists will recognize as having a long genealogy themselves, thinking about education as use value versus exchange value. And to the extent that we can emphasize use value and emphasize the meaningfulness of what people are doing and diminish the exchange value, the points, the credits, the credentials, which people are doing not for themselves, but for others, the more we can attempt to get more meaningful learning. So that instead of students saying, "What do you want? Is this right? Is this okay?" What we get is, "Can you help me do this thing that I want to do?" And if that's what we get to, then we are in a less schoolish condition, and there's more chance that people will thrive. So that's all I'm going to say right now. And I will turn it over to Jean, who has some things to say.
Hope that will work. Knowing Susan and reading Susan's book has just been a delight and an enormous pleasure, personal and intellectual. And it's great to be here, and I'm so happy to be doing this with you guys. And I wanted to start by saying that I was struck at the beginning of the book with her saying how hard it was to write. And I believe her. I think that it was an incredibly difficult process. And I've been thinking about why. And I should just say, to start with, that sounds ridiculous to me because can this woman write? Wow, she's a superb writer. She writes novels on the side just for the fun of it. I didn't know if you knew that, but I didn't know if she wanted you to know that either, but I thought I wouldn't ask beforehand. And she is in writing so well. This book, as her other work, is deeply accessible and engaging, and it's funny. And you know, she could be a stand-up comic if she wanted to. So why was it hard? So not because of Susan being Susan, it probably because the world is the way the world is. And what's that? And what might we say about it? It seems to me, I would just say also, it shouldn't have been, it shouldn't have been that hard to write, right? Because the suffering of students, the student suffering in schools seems all too accessible to us, all too available, and just a bromide in the world. You know, you hear someone saying, yeah, I've got to go to school today. And fill that in with what we all know, either can empathize with or guess or project onto others and so on. So it isn't that what she's talking about is hard to defend as something in the world. The alienation and the misery of students is something that we are all know and we're all concerned about. So that isn't why it was hard. Oh, so it seems to me that when Susan began to explain that as an anthropologist, your job is to make what the fish bowl in which we are the goldfish, somehow to figure out what the water and the bowl and whatever else is in the world is, when you're in it yourself, it is an extremely difficult thing to do. And anytime that fishbowl is made of institutions, political economic relations, history, culture, and our own experience from small children until now. I don't know how many years you've spent in academic institutions, but you know, I'm really, really old, and I just have to sort of take about 5 years away, and the rest I don't want to tell you. But you know, so the difficulty in trying to articulate and analyze and figure out what is this phenomenon of students suffering in schoolish contexts, and give us an analysis that's deep and comprehensive and complex. That is hard. And so I think her book is a gift to us because she's giving us the gift of laying out for us in seriously analytic terms the major elements of what constitutes this thing, which, you know, I'm glad to call it schoolishness for now. Let's just do that. We can, you know, we can fight about that afterwards if anybody wants to. I can't imagine anyone does, though. So, but I mean, we're all here ready to fight at a moment's notice, I'm sure. Why is this? It's a gift because now supposing that someone in what we can do, given that we haven't got that analysis at hand, we don't have access to her book. We can complain a lot. We can say what a terrible mess schooling is. We ought to fix schools. we ought to fix schooling. But you say that, and how do you go on from that statement to offer something beyond just the recognition that there's a problem? And for the most part, we don't have the tools to do that. And what her book gives us, so now someone says to you, my God, you think we should fix schools? What do you think we ought to do? And you say, well, actually, there are 10 dimensions to the phenomenon of schoolishness. And furthermore, and this is another thing she has done for us that I think is really important, is that those 10 chapters, the 10 facets or aspects of schoolishness, that isn't a list. It's a complex set of relations, which leads her to talk about the structures of schoolishness. They're intertwined with each other. They make each other. And you right away, here's another kind of conversation. Someone says to you, you know, I know how to fix schools. We should just extend the school day, more time. And you can say, well, actually, if you look carefully at the time dimensions, which are deeply entwined with spatial dimensions and with the authority, the competition, the, you know, everything else, I don't think it's possible to do that one thing at a time. Maybe we should talk further, or possibly we should read Susan's book together, right? So I think what I want to say is that I think this is a gift to all of us, because now we have the possibility in conversations, among other things, just general life, of offering in response to just a recognition that there's a problem, some points, you know, take 3 of the 10 and be ready at all times to propose them if somebody just says, oh, there's a problem. So it seemed to me that there were not only can we, part of what she gives us is the ability to understand and articulate for ourselves and others what the dimensions of schoolishness and their structural interrelations are. But you know, this book is not just, let's tell you what's wrong with the world. Over and over in the book, she gives us the benefit often of her extraordinary career as a teacher, experimenting with her classes and with the love and energy and thought she puts into the way in which she teaches. And so, among other things, this book is a gift to those who share a kind of despair at schoolishness in institutional settings that we occupy. But there are in this book many ideas about the things you can do to, I don't know, one of my favorite works is subversion, to subvert schoolishness, to really do something else. And that is to work at possibilities for getting education to happen, yea, even in the school. And that is a further gift to us all.
So first, let me say how honored I am to be a part of the conversation. What a joy it is to be here with Jean and with Susan to reflect on what really is a remarkable book. And I concur with Jean that it is an absolute gift. So just a few reflections. The book contains everything one wants to see in a traditional, typical scholarly monograph. It addresses a topic of significance. It offers a brokered encounter between key conversation partners and offers a compelling set of recommendations for further reflection. It doesn't answer all the significant questions, but it lets you know what you should be querying and why. But it also contains what one wants to see most in books that focus on really complex topics today. It honors Susan's context and foregrounds her voice, something that is all too important in new ethnographic writing. It engages multiple epistemic domains. So this is a transdisciplinary kind of monograph. It is appropriately transgressive. So it's thinking outside of the box, which is great. And it creatively blurs genre boundaries. So you need to go to page Roman numeral 15 and highlight the following quote. This book is manifesto and tirade, pamphlet and prayer, autoethnography and annotated bibliography, lament and dream. And since I started reading it, it has been my constant companion as I teach and as I engage students. I'm particularly moved by her placement of the Allies and Acknowledgements chapter at the end of the book rather than at the beginning, because it suggests to me that there is ongoing fruitful dialogue that will continue in the future. I appreciate Susan's providing a name and taxonomy of features for a phenomenon that I recognize as impactful, positively and problematically, in my own intellectual formation. I'm grateful for a challenge to think about what might be done to mitigate the harmful effects of schoolish norms, reimagine education at all levels, and enact practices that leverage our natural learning capacities as human beings. And here are four: to learn with others, to provide dignity, to enable our classes to be democratic, joyful, calm, and cooperative. And, as I think back on my own graduate school days, my graduate courses were places where joy, democracy, calm, and cooperation went to die. And she also talks about the importance of fostering confident, independent, joyous, effective learners who can ask questions. That's really quite powerful. And so every time I walk into the one graduate seminar that I'm teaching this semester, and I only have 2 students, but it's still a seminar, I think about that. And I hope that I am not in some ways replicating the negative experiences that I've had as a graduate student and as a faculty member at times in that classroom. And your book reminds me that I have to be mindful of that at all times. So let me say a little bit about what shaped my reading of Schoolishness. So I was raised in a family of Black teachers and academic administrators. They were educated at HBCUs in the Jim Crow South. And teaching was one of few options open to them, especially the women who were in the family. I have a photo taken in my grandfather's basement of my mother, a couple of aunts, a couple of uncles. My father took the picture. It was taken, I believe, in 1948 or 1949. And, it reminds me of the incredible challenges that they overcame and the attenuated dreams that they had to navigate as they pursued their aspirations. To a great extent, those who went into the teaching profession had to embrace facets of schoolishness so that they could be employed. They understood the power dynamics that were active in a segregated educational system. But then I also recall the ways that they subtly dismantled many of those dimensions that were necessary for their own survival in their personal encounters with those in our family that they taught, and those in our neighborhood and in their neighborhoods that they encountered who were being victimized by those things. And so what were the loci of their resistance? Well, they did it in their homes. They did it in their churches. They did it through neighborhood organizations. And they did it through local networks that they established for themselves, out or beyond the gaze of those who would do them harm. What were the modes of resistance? Well, informal teaching, alternative modes of recognition, and resourcing and support off the grid. So one of the funny things that I recall about my mother's car, and this was true up until the time that she passed last year, there was essentially a school supply shop in the trunk containing things that she bought for herself, that she could share in the various settings in which she continued to teach and mentor students even after her retirement. I had a blackboard in my basement. I was the only kid on the block, and I've said this before, we had a blackboard in his basement. And, you know, that's where my father, you know, taught me the multiplication tables. And that's where I learned, you know, how to write cursive and how to block print and so forth and so on. It was their way of making sure that whatever the norms were that were at times totally unfair in the schoolish institutions that I attended, a way of subverting them, a way of offering a different way of thinking about how you can esteem yourself as you learn complex stuff in the larger world. So having been raised in a family of teachers, I'm not surprised that I ended up where I am right now, but in a totally different discipline. So part of my reading of Schoolishness is based on my experience as an African-American Semitic philologist who was trained at predominantly white institutions, seminaries, and at Harvard, where the claim to fame was limiting access, at times on racial grounds, to training and professional opportunities. So this wasn't a field that had wide open arms that welcomed me into it. And I learned all of those ancient languages that I acquired in highly competitive, extraordinarily successful environments where the goal was to weed out those who were weak, those who were unworthy, to identify the superstar survivors, and to present a hierarchy for those who were appropriate to receive the imprimatur of the institution. So, you know, as a result, I recall learning Greek inductively. I learned Akkadian and Hebrew and Latin deductively. I taught myself Sumerian. And my memories and my feelings about the me that I have come to be that have grown out of those learning experiences are palpably different. I remember sitting in the library at the Harvard Divinity School in the basement and, you know, working with 3 friends and saying, you know, something like, yo, y'all, I really love this. That didn't come from being in a classroom. That came from working with friends, tackling stuff that, you know, was really difficult, but also building a community in so doing. I also remember having many dreams when I was taking first year Akkadian of being consumed by parts of speech. And I know what the source of that was. I mean, I learned the language in a classroom where we were pitted against one another. That was the course that weeded you out as a first-year doctoral student of finishing your PhD or being able to pursue it. You know, my memories of learning Sumerian, you know, I taught myself Sumerian with a grammar starting, I want to say, in 1991. in coffee shops and in parking lots, and there was a palpable kind of enjoyment, a sense of love and accomplishment that accompanied that. And, I think back on that and I wish that that had been my experience in many of the other languages that I took. But, that's the way it is. So, when I think about this book and when I think about the students that I now teach, the end of my career is clearly closer than the beginning. But I just want to undo the damage. And I don't want to replicate. And if my students leave any course that I teach feeling a sense of empowerment, a sense of joy, a sense of control over their own learning, then I'll feel that I've done something good, and I will owe an incredible amount of my mindfulness about what needs to be done to encourage that to Susan in her book.
So I know you all have questions for me, but I wanted to respond to that because one of the things that's really shocking when you start to do research into this is how many people have dreams, how many people have nightmares about school. And that's not only the bad students, it's not only the ones who were sent to detention and not only the ones who are flunking, but in some ways the damage is worse for the successful students who are so panicked about missing their mark of perfection in our system that's constantly sorting them. And so this idea of being unprepared for a test, being late, not knowing where the classroom is. Teachers have it too, of course, but this idea of dread and fear in school. There is a whole literature about fear in school. And surely that's not what we want. Surely that isn't the case. I wanted to build on the language example because I've studied a lot of languages. I love learning languages. And I've thought quite a lot about why people are learning languages. And one of the things that schools tend to say is, you must learn this, you must learn that. And there's a lot of discussion about the content of our classes, of our schools, of our curriculum. Are we going to make everybody take a diversity class? Are we going to make everybody take a sustainability class? Do they have to take algebra? There are algebra wars that are so intense that somebody who has questioned this requirement has gotten death threats. So this is Jo Bowler at Stanford has gotten death threats because she has dared to question the necessity of everybody learning algebra. But one of the things that we often say is they need to do it for their own good. We're going to force them to do it, and they will learn it. They will be good citizens. They will be good workers. The evidence is they don't learn it, and it doesn't stick. They don't transfer. Transfer is sort of a technical education term. There isn't a lot of transfer between the stuff we're forcing them to do in the classroom unwillingly and being able to do it outside the classroom. I always ask my students, what languages have you studied? What languages do you know? And over they tell me, I've had 8 years of Spanish, but I can't speak it. Or, I took French for 4 years in high school, but I don't remember any of it. And part of it is because what they're forced to do is to collect these credits for exchange value. They don't have a motive. There's no sense of use value. They don't say, I want to read this poetry in this language. I want to read Pablo Neruda, so I'm going to learn Spanish so I can read this poetry. Kind of this self-study that makes it meaningful for you. And teachers are constantly, either they're threatening the students and saying, you have to get this grammar right, or they're trying really, really, really hard to motivate the student one way or another. A lot of the work that's done in classrooms, and if you talk to teachers, a lot of what we do is trying to get students to care about our subject because they haven't chosen it and because it's being imposed on them. And so this kind of conflict in goals between teachers and students is really bizarre. You don't see it in the wild. when people are learning how to do a craft, or they're learning to play a sport, when they're learning to do art, play music, the coach is on the side of the learner. But what we have in school is adversaries. And so the students are trying to fool the teacher, and the teacher is trying to like surveil the students, that we're trying to outsmart them. We're trying to see, did they cheat? Are they lying to us? And so the goals aren't aligned. And these relationships are really harmful, but they're really part of the structure of school. You've got the punitive master standing there watching the students and ready to impose penalties. And that is a really fundamental part of conventional schooling. And it doesn't have to be that way, because people learn really well without that. And in fact, I would say they don't learn really well with this. It's not to say that people don't learn things. Clearly, many people learn many things, even if they don't want to, but they should, but that seems very bizarre to me. You have questions? We're improvising here. This is not scripted. This is not, well, I think this is an example of authentic being together for learning, which is my definition of school. School can be wonderful because you assemble people. Co-presence is precious, as we learned during COVID. And that's sort of, in some ways, writing this book was hard because I had so many criticisms too. But COVID helped me see kind of, we were also missing something. There is something wonderful about being together for a meaningful purpose. And so how do we increase that and diminish the rest?
So here's says, you make distinctions throughout your book between schooling and education. I like that distinction a lot. I think it's really important, and that we should stop being careless about equating them. They clearly aren't the same thing. You talk of education, and I think this is just a beautiful and wonderful idea. You talk of education as a gathering for learning. That is, it's not individual. It's may or may not be intentional, but I think that's in there. And it's gathering for the learning is something that people do together. Much of your book is about being able to recognize and help to create gatherings for learning. The last chapter about the internship project and so on, is about finding ways for students to gather with others for learning. You're doing other things at the same time, but it's terribly important. That's what's going on. All right, so now, with this definition of education, do you really need, do any of us really need that old classification system of formal education, informal education, non-formal education? And one that really bothers me, the idea of learning in the wild? No. It seems to me that education, in your sense, is something to recognize everywhere in the world, in all aspects of our lives, in what it means to talk about everyday life and all of that contains when you treat that as kind of all there is. I think that classification system is another structural part of schoolishness. What are your thoughts?
Well, I actually like the phrase learning in the wild. I might disagree with you about that. In the sense that, what?
Where's the what?
Oh. So if school, the walls, the structures, the institution defines a certain kind of formal schooling, then the learning that happens outside that is perhaps in the wild, but perhaps it's a distinction. I will ponder this for a while.
Those extensions, and you spend a lot of your life, as it turns out, thinking about or trying to do ethnographic research and see the kind of learning that you value very much, and even your examples. Well, no, I don't want to say that. And that you find examples of in other places than in schools. I think part of your message is that gatherings for learning are possible even in schools. And so that, you know, I did this a long time ago, invented this notion of situated learning, which is just a no-brainer idea. But learning is situated everywhere for everybody at all times. It's, you know, it's just perfectly obvious, it seems to me. But the thing is, the reception of that over a gazillion years has been, oh, that's a very nice concept. We're talking about craft apprenticeship or low-level work things or learning things that are not schoolish. But what that does is draw a line that says whatever goes on in school or by experts or professors isn't situated learning, something that category error, which I've objected to for many years. But the same thing's true with the concept of education. If you, to the extent that it gets associated, you should be answering this question.
So I think I try to define schooling, learning, and education. And learning doesn't, education, I think, is a deliberate attempt to learn something. There's a lot of inadvertent learning that we pick up along the way. Young children are learning all the time without anybody necessarily teaching them. And that's certainly true for language. I've spent a lot of time actually looking at how young children learn, and they are almost never taught. And American parents and many parents in many places in the world, at least white middle-class American parents, believe that they are teaching their children to talk. They are not teaching their children to talk. They are sometimes paying attention to certain ideologically fraught dimensions of the talking. You know, be polite, say please, you know, say hello to grandma, stuff like that. But they're not teaching their children grammar. They're not teaching them how to use the past participle, because parents have no idea what that even is. So they're not teaching, and children learn it really, really fast. So there is learning I would say there is learning without education. And there's also schooling without learning. And there's a book by Alison Gopnik called The Carpenter and the Gardener, or The Gardener and the Carpenter. And she talks about how kids learn to play baseball. They learn to play baseball by like going out and hitting baseballs and getting better at the baseball. But they learn science by learning the history of science. They learn the theory of science. They learn what other people have done when they're learning science. And then in graduate school, maybe they actually get to do science. So that is a kind of, I would say it is so artificial, the stuff that they're learning. It's like, I knew a friend of one of my daughters, his mother was a Spanish speaker. So he grew up speaking Spanish. And he went to school to take Spanish. And he didn't do well, because he said it's the theory of Spanish. It's not actually Spanish. Just like we're giving our students math without giving them the opportunity to wonder and to have curiosity and to see, wow, it's amazing. There are patterns in the world. I want to understand the patterns. And so then you can show them what others have discovered about math. Part of the way we teach STEM fields is often as if it's finished, as if it's dead and it's all finite and everybody knows it, which is one of the things that was so interesting to me. So Jean mentioned this, one of the chapters in the book comes from ethnographic research I did in South Bend for 3 summers at the Bowman Creek Educational Ecosystem. It's now called the Center for Civic Engagement. And so I was watching engineers and other interns actually do engineering. And so some of them had some academic background in engineering, some of them had computer backgrounds, some had economic backgrounds, some had science, some had social science. But what they had was an authentic goal of trying to do something, trying to fix the rain gardens so that there was less runoff. But to do that, they had to actually understand about filtration, and they had to understand about gravel, and they had to know about rain, and they had to learn how to use Arduinos, and they had to do all kinds of things. They had to learn programming, but they were motivated to do it because it had an effect in the world. And so I would say that is absolutely situated learning in the sense that they were working with others. There were guides, there were mentors who were available to help. People said they learned how to program a certain thing because they wanted to do it, but it was not the sort of, here we will feed you how to do this program and you won't ever use it. We're going to pretend you're going to use it on this problem that I have defined for you. And the students tell me when they do that, they learn this stuff for the test and they forget it as fast as they can. And I have had students tell me that over and over and over for years. And so I think distinguishing learning, you can learn in school, no question about it. But the kind of learning, the kind of affect that is associated with the kind of fear-based learning in school that is disconnected and predetermined by a powerful teacher is very different from the kind of learning we do in other contexts, which is not to say, you know what I was going to say. I was going to say in the wild, but I think that the distinction, analysts do distinguish formal education, non-formal education, informal education, and that can get really slippery and well, let's just call it schoolishness. Okay. Okay.
This really inspiring message that education, in the sense of gatherings for learning, are possible anywhere in the world.
Sure.
And the news is that you believe they're also possible in school.
Yes.
That's the news. And if that's the news, which I think it is wonderful, and indeed not as just a kind of a general point, but in all of the ways in your book you talk about the things you try and do to create joyous moments of people gathering to learn together, that any barriers you put, you're making a distinction that really matters between that, gatherings for learning, which is education, from schoolishness, and from schooling as an institution whose educational qualities would depend on whether what was going on inside was gatherings for learning or not, right? But that's true everywhere else in the world, so that I kind of like the idea of kind of airbrushing out some of those distinctions, which really boil down to other sets of structures for preventing people from educating themselves and each other in your beautiful terms about gatherings for learning. And I think we should do for those other terms maybe what you've just done for schools and schoolishness, but question them some. Would you be willing to question?
I'm happy to question anything. Okay, Hugh, do you have a final question?
How do I keep from destroying the microphone?
Can't help you, but I bet somebody here can. We can.
I'm happy to yield because, since we're being improvisational, I'd love to hear the questions that others that are assembled would like to pose.
So, certain words. Hello. Certain words have stood out for me. One, the image of the chalkboard in the basement, the creation of a space that served a real deeply felt need surreptitiously if necessary, strategically, tactically, cunningly, desperately, many layers. And then your comment immediately after, I would have loved to have a chalkboard in the basement. So real things at stake, real desires that a person is allowed to express and act upon, gathered in a space that people have made that is responsive to real needs, real desires, instead of being structured so heavily from the outside. Anyway, I love these little fragments that keep sparking out of all three of you. So years ago, my brother, a journalist, visited a class at a school for the deaf and wrote an article about it. And he sat in the back of the room and observed the class. And the students were sitting in rows, and he noticed they were all signing to each other surreptitiously behind the back of the person in front of them. It's like, we're doing this on our own terms here. And when I was a young teacher, I would have thought, oh, those are bad students. And then later I became a supervisor of teachers and a trainer of teachers. And I would have thought, well, if that teacher doesn't do something, that would be a bad teacher. But actually, in the run of comments that you all have made and the little bits of language that keep sparking out and catching my attention, the interesting part of the story of the students signing to each other behind the backs of the teacher is the desire that so many people at so many moments of every day would love to be able to act upon. And we can create places where that has a better chance of happening. And that wasn't really a question, but I'm done.
Well, classroom management is something that a lot of teachers are supposed to excel at, which means controlling the students, stifling their side comments, making sure they sit still, making sure that they're obedient and that they are subject to the coercion of the authority. And here you have the escaping, and students at all levels in all schools are doing that all the time. Now they could text each other, they could, whatever it is they're doing, because there is, this idea of stillness and solitude, which is kind of bred into this idea of solitary testing, not being able to consult outside resources. That's a model of learning, which is individualistic and it is competitive, and it's not how we actually function in the world. So why is it? People have talked a lot about the industrial model, the factory model of education, where every individual is sort of a uniform producer of their widgets, which are tests or something. And clearly people are rebelling. Their humanness is rebelling against that. And so I love this image of the signing. I assume that the teacher could understand it too. So they weren't pulling anything over on the teacher. Oh, interesting. That's a good trick.
Okay, folks. So for those who are online, I need to just offer a reminder that there's a text box where you can put in a question if you'd like, and a staff member here will read it out loud to our colleagues on the stage. And it looks like I have a question back there.
Could you use the microphone for accessibility?
Okay.
Thank you.
I want to start by prefacing this with a thank you and then ask what I think might be a hard question. Okay. All right.
Okay.
The thank you is just the fact that you've been here and you've been writing what you're writing and you're at Notre Dame has given me the bravery to throw out old assignments and do new assignments for different sorts of reasons that I don't always want the administrators to look at, but people can learn, right? And that kind of bravery, I mean, I'm gratitude from the bottom of my heart. So does that make sense? So I value what you do. So let me then ask you a hard question, all right? And that's about poor kids and public education.
Mhm.
Number one. Number two, the way kids are, if you will, focused, wired up, they're different now than when, for example, when we used to read about John Holt and Ivan Illich and all that other kind of stuff. I'm old enough to have been excited by that as new stuff a long time ago, right? Deschooling them, all that kind of stuff, which is, you're doing other stuff, but there's a way, no, you are. As a historian, I'm a historian, I'm not an anthropologist. I study change over time, and I learned about 10 years ago that these students, even at Notre Dame, where they're absolutely brilliant, are different. They don't read. Reading is hard. They think in different sorts of ways. Texts is a foreign language to them in a certain way, especially if they had phones before they were 8, because they can get through all that text, but it's like reading Latin. It's not their natural, you know what I mean? Now, okay, just to take that as a premise. I also have, jumping around, but I'm getting back to the South Bend Public Schools, where relatively few of our students come from, where my own kid went until I pulled her out. I adopted a kid. She's 20 today, so I adopted her when she was 8, so 12 years ago. Though it was wonderful, it was a blessing. Thank God I became a better person because of it. I was not a great mom, so it was a wonderful thing for me. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't want to take compliments for doing that, so it was great. But there she is in the school, and I now know her sisters, other people who go there. I mean, how do I say it? You know, and I know that they're warehoused in the old ways. You know, and I know that there's no money even for you can't de-school them because number one, they come in, they have things they're interested in. The teachers don't know what they're really interested in because the teachers don't understand what their lives are like, especially like what the 16% of American kids who live under the poverty line. Teachers don't know this. So the kids are interested in learning things potentially, but they're not going to want to learn things with texts because most of the way they learn and their older brothers and sisters learn are from things like TikTok and Instagram, right? They're interested in a variety of things that don't count as schooling, don't count as education in terms of class. You know what I'm trying to say? And the only way to make this kind of thing work would be to put twice as much money in in terms of for poor schools, and nobody's ever going to do that. What do you do with that?
Okay. So, well, I think that, so I study, yes. I have a background in linguistic anthropology. I'm interested in texts. I'm interested in how people interact with different media. I'm teaching a class next semester on what's it called? Zoom text talk something sing chat. So it's about media. And it is certainly the case that over time, people interact differently with different modalities and different media, and that there have been a lot of new forms of communication that our younger students are particularly shaped by. And I think that the challenge for teachers, not just in poor schools, but in all schools, is to meet the students where they are, to understand how they are interacting with material, whether it's written, visual, audio, whatever it is, and then to really think about the goals. So one of the things that people my age did, we grew up with writing. There were books, and that was kind of what there was. There is more now. Is it possible to learn from a video as opposed to from a written text? What are the reasons somebody would choose a written text as opposed to a video? I think the challenge for us as teachers is to really figure out how are the students going to encounter material in an effective way. If the topic of the course is learning to read, let's say, old written texts, then that is a goal. Why would the students want to do that? It seems to me that the challenge for us then is to help them see that there's a use for it, not just because we tell them to. And, I think resources are certainly unequal in this country more than in a lot of other parts of the world because of our property tax base as the way of funding schools. And so we could change the political way that we think about funding schools, but it's not only money. It's not all money. It's also the way people are interacting with the children as humans. Are they allowing them to run? Are they forcing them to sit with this idea that they have to have grit? And so they're going to be sort of punished until they develop this grit? What are the other needs of the children? As I tell my students when I remember to, because I've been teaching a long time and I don't always remember all the things I intellectually know now, but I try to remember that they are humans first, learners second, and then, of course, for them, they are achievers, but I try not to make the achievement dominate. And, if somebody's hungry, if somebody has an unstable family situation, why would they care about reading a text from 200 years ago? Like, that seems maybe not what we should be putting our emphasis on. So I think that it is absolutely unconscionable that we have this kind of inequality, but I'm not sure that more of the same is really going to solve it.
To that, I would say that I was educated in public schools and didn't have a whole lot of resources either in elementary school. The junior high school I went to was forcefully integrated, so it had more resources. The high school I went to was the first African American high school in Baltimore. Not a whole lot of resources. And, the most valuable education I think I received from the teachers that I had there and also from parents and grandparents had to do with learning how to turn your critical gaze on the circumstances in which you found yourself and becoming, as it were, a sort of revolutionary self-taught historian and anthropologist and asking, why is it that, our textbooks are so beaten up? Why is it that the athletic supplies that we have when our teams compete are so incredibly bad? Why is it that we're going to go play a tennis match against, a really well-heeled private school? And those guys are going to come out carrying 5 tennis rackets in brand new clothing, and we're not. And what results in that? Why are there such incredible systemic problems that we can't seem to overcome? And it doesn't do any good not to acknowledge them because that's going to produce even more stress. And, there are times when even just being able to have someone equip you to ask the question about inequity is enough. It was certainly enough for me. There weren't ways that we could fix those things, but it's not left me. It certainly had an impact on where I chose to go to college. And- yeah. hmm Yeah. Well, I mean, we need a lot more people who are willing to do a kind of heavy lifting that involves prophetic truth telling and empowerment, not just of students, but of entire family systems. So, the number of people that found their way into our house when I was growing up was enormous, because they knew that my mother would tell them the truth My father would tell them the truth, and they would do what they could to enable them to survive within inequitable systems, but also be mindful enough to know that they had to find some ways to subvert them. And that's not an easy thing when you don't have a whole lot of power. But if you know, I'll just be frank, if you know the system is screwed up and you can acknowledge that it's screwed up, then whatever you need to do to get through, you can do without losing your soul. You lose your soul if you just do it because you need to get to the other side. But if you do it to get to the other side and you manage not to forget that it needs to be fixed and that you may not be able to fix it right now, but as soon as you have the ability to do it, however small the measure might be, you're going to do it. Then, I think the battle is enjoined, and there's a chance of winning the war.
This is on. Is it on? Yes. Okay. So a lot of the conversation this evening has revolved around how to kind of remove schoolishness from school settings. But I'd be curious to hear if you think that this is an interpretive framework that we can use to think about dynamics of authority, authenticity outside of these settings. And if you see schoolishness as something that's sort of leaking out into wider social contexts. And I have kind of two points of data in mind and thinking about this. One is being the parent of a very young child and being absolutely bombarded with ideologies about upper middle class parenting that are saturated in schoolishness. And the other is like to the point that even though I have like a PhD in comparative human development and I know that this stuff is bullshit, that I'm like, should I buy the Montessori toy? Will my child learn to walk without it or talk? I mean, preposterous. And then on the other side of it, thinking a little bit like many people in this room, I have consumed a lot of hot takes about American politics over the last 2 weeks. And I've been struck by how many of the hot takes are about ideas about expertise that I think also actually reflect an ideology of schoolishness, an idea about what it means to know and what it means to learn and teach. And so I wonder if you think that this is a category and a framework that we could use to understand processes beyond educational systems that are structural.
Well, that's a great question, Julia. And I do think that schoolishness has leaked certainly into parenting. And that then leaks into medicine. And because pediatrics, my father, if you're still watching, is a pediatrician. And when you go with a young child to the pediatrician, they will ask, how are you doing in school? What are your grades? Grades in school are, if you have good grades, you get lower car insurance for your children. I mean, their medication for ADHD is correlated by the grades that children are getting. And so there is this leakage for sure of schoolishness, which seems to, in some sense, define childhood. So I have written about this thing called the language gap, which is the idea that poor children of color are exposed to fewer words than wealthy children of white families, professional families. And if you extrapolate that, it will supposedly, it's not true, but it will supposedly add up to 30 million words, which has been sort of memified as the word gap, the 30 million word gap. And so now there are programs where social workers are teaching families how to practice vocabulary with their young children so they can sort of close this gap. And they're doing it like teachers. They're doing it exactly like teachers. And middle-class white parents talk to their children like teachers. So there is, as you know, there is a kind of structure which linguistic anthropologists and educational anthropologists, Courtney Kasdan and Hugh, or you call him Buddy, Meehan, have identified as IRE, initiation, response, evaluation. And that is kind of the core interaction that is schoolish. What does a horse say? Good job. Okay, that is the sort of quintessential schoolish exchange. And it is not universal. Parents don't have to do that. They don't do it everywhere. Not everybody in the United States does it. And everybody learns what horses say. But what that exchange is doing is it's preparing children to be passive, waiting to be quizzed by their parents exactly the way they will be quizzed in school. So when they show up in school, there is a match between the kinds of exchanges or genres we do at home and the genres or exchanges that we do in school. And it also teaches a kind of dependence and a kind of insecurity because you're constantly waiting for validation. You're waiting to see, is this right? Do I know the answer? Where is my gold star? Where is somebody going to say, good job? I don't feel confident until I get the pat on the head. And so that kind of schoolishness absolutely it has oozed into our society and many other societies in East Asia, which I'm familiar with. It's also very prominent, a lot of teaching. Parents see themselves as the teachers of their children, even though in a lot of other societies, children grow up, they learn to be perfectly competent members of their society without this kind of direct instruction and direct quizzing. I don't know if I want to weigh into the hot take about the election season and expertise, but certainly there are people who are validated as authorities, and usually that has to do with, well, depending on who. Sometimes it has to do with academic credentials, and sometimes it has to do with how many followers you have. And so there are different ways to develop authority.
I've sort of been given the wrap it up sign. So I'm going to say a few closing remarks here about my friend and dear colleague Susan and her accomplishment here. But if you have more questions for Susan or would like to have a conversation with Jean, Susan, and Hugh, please join us at the reception, which will be right across the hallway here. And I know I'm standing between those of you, is this on? So I'm standing between you and food and drink. So I'm gonna cut this a little short because I didn't know quite the scope of what the conversation was gonna look like. So a lot of the kind of comments I wanted to make it's really about the process that led Susan here to writing this book. And I wanna recognize it for the tremendous accomplishment that I think everyone has described it as, but also as a culmination of 20 years of thinking and unlearning and intrinsically motivated learning and transformation. So in other words, I think the process by which Susan has generated this book, Schoolishness, actually embodies a lot of the principles that underpin the kind of concepts of schoolishness. And I think that's really admirable. As a fellow parent of young kids, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, I find a lot of motivation, kind of motivation for self-reflection and changing or thinking about what I'm doing with my kids on a day-to-day basis. Motivation to help continue to stimulate their creativity, and also, frankly, kind of some unease about how complicit I may be in kind of the culture of schooling and squelching the really beautiful creativity that they still have at this young age, and wanting kind of thinking about how long that may last, but really taking inspiration that it could last a lot longer if I encourage it in a anti-schoolish kind of way. And in terms of, as a colleague of Susan's, I find really tremendous inspiration in schoolishness as a culminating achievement and an example of what you can be as a teacher scholar at an institution like Notre Dame. It provides us a guide not only to harness the curiosity and ingenuity of our students, our really brilliant students who can be intrinsically motivated to learn about the things that they care about. But I also think it can reinvigorate us to think about the less schoolish questions that inspired us to be scholars in the first place. And so we can bring this not only to bear in the classroom, but I think also on our own research and scholarship, and hopefully kind of reignite some of those intellectual passions that brought us to this great university in the first place. So I'm still standing in the way of the drinks we would use to toast Susan, but when you have a drink in hand, please toast her and congratulate her. And if you would, please give Jean, Hugh, and Susan another round of applause. Okay, now eat and drink.
Okay.